The midnight cabin sighed with the rhythm of pressurized air, a chorus of unseen machines keeping fragile humanity aloft. Row 12, window seat. Connor Hayes dozed against the chilled glass, his breath fogging a crescent on the window. His jaw, unshaven and weary, carried the shadow of years without laughter. Beside him, 7-year-old Riley curled into sleep, her small frame folded like punctuation at the end of a sentence. In her lap, a coloring book slid sideways, pages of blue crayon skies and silver airplanes creased from too much hope. At 37,000 feet, the engines hummed like lullabies written by metal and fire. The passengers floated in half-dreams, trusting the unseen hands in the cockpit. But then the hymn faltered. A tremor rippled through the fuselage. A pause, a skip. The overhead bins rattled like bones in a restless grave. The soft glow of cabin lights flickered, then surrendered to amber strips along the aisles. Shadows stretched across faces, strangers caught between slumber and panic. The intercom cracked alive with static, its hiss more frightening than words. Then came the voice, a woman's voice, firm but trembling at the edges of composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an immediate emergency. Is there a pilot on board?" The words tore through Connor's sleep like shrapnel. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding against ribs that remembered another sky. His thumb brushed against the watch strapped to his wrist, its broken hands forever frozen at 11:17, the moment 3 years ago, when his life had splintered in a storm of jet fuel and fire. Riley stirred, the coloring book slipping from her lap. Her tiny fingers clawed at his sleeve, clinging to the faded flannel that smelled faintly of oil and sleepless nights. Around them, passengers blinked into wakefulness, twisting in their seats with the jerky rhythm of birds startled from a branch. Heads turned, eyes darted, breaths quickened. The glow of the amber lights painted every face with a sickly pallor, as though mortality itself had settled into the cabin. Connor's chest tightened, memory colliding with present. The phantom scent of burning desert air, the groan of flight controls answering his touch, the echo of Marcus's last words over a dead radio, all of it roared back. He pressed his palm against the cold window, watching the navigation lights blink Morse code against a sky that no longer trusted him. The intercom hissed again. "This is First Officer Jessica Park. Captain Mitchell has suffered a medical emergency and is unable to continue. We require immediate assistance. Anyone with pilot experience, military or civilian." The voice from the cockpit carried that brittle calm of someone tiptoeing along the edge of panic, each syllable chosen like ammunition rationed in wartime. Connor knew that tone. He had used it himself years ago when a student pilot froze at the controls and 40,000 pounds of steel and fuel dangled between heaven and earth. The chronometer on his wrist mocked him now, its fractured hands still frozen at 11:17. The moment time had stopped for him, the instant when everything he believed about his skill and destiny shattered like glass under pressure. Around him, the cabin was beginning to understand. This wasn't turbulence. This wasn't a false alarm. This was the moment when ordinary people prayed that someone extraordinary was sitting among them. The air thickened with realization, whispers swelling like a rising tide. A businessman in first class raised his voice above the drone of engines, demanding answers from a trembling flight attendant. 2 rows up, a woman clutched her phone as if it were a lifeline, weeping into the receiver with hurried confessions of love. Children whimpered, their cries mingling with whispered prayers in languages that stretched across continents. But in row 12, everything shrank to a pair of wide eyes. Riley's, amber emergency light reflected in them like lanterns in a storm. She clutched Connor's arm with tiny fingers that dug into worn flannel, her voice breaking the silence between them. "Daddy," one word, one plea, one question she'd never dared to ask until now. The medals in the closet, the photographs turned face down, the smell of jet fuel clinging to him even though he swore he was just a mechanic. All those unspoken mysteries trembled in her voice. Connor smoothed down her messy hair with trembling fingers. He wanted to lie, to tell her everything was fine. But her gaze demanded the truth, the kind of truth too heavy for bedtime stories. "Remember what Daddy does for work?" he whispered. She nodded, her chin quivering, brave in a way only children can be. "I fix airplanes to make them safe." But before that, his throat burned as the words left him. "A long time ago I used to fly them." The confession tasted like rust. 3 years of silence broken in a single sentence. 3 years of guilt and grief dragged into the light by the weight of 180 lives depending on him. Riley's grip loosened slightly, her small mind piecing together a puzzle she'd never known she was missing. Are you going to fix this one, Daddy?" she asked, her trust more terrifying than any turbulence. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes had already shifted to the cockpit door, the portal to a world he had abandoned. The world where his hands once commanded altitude and airspeed with the certainty of a king. The aircraft shuddered violently, lights flickering like dying fireflies. Bins rattled, overhead panels groaned like old bones under stress. Passengers gasped, clutching armrests with white knuckles. Connor stood, unbuckling his belt with hands that remembered muscle memory he had tried to bury. The cabin around him transformed into a theater of chaos. Strangers caught between panic and denial, each one searching the aisle for salvation. As he rose, a hush fell over his section, eyes turning to him as if drawn by some unspoken recognition. The man in the flannel shirt with the mechanic's hands and the soldier's shoulders. The man who looked like he belonged somewhere else, maybe in a story where heroes still existed. "Where are you going?" Riley's voice was small, frightened, but it cut through the noise like a blade. He crouched down to her level, holding her face in his hands so she could see him, really see him. "I need to help, sweetheart." His voice trembled, but his eyes were steady, burning with something he thought he'd lost forever. Riley's lip quivered, but she nodded, because children sometimes understand sacrifice better than adults. He kissed her forehead, then turned toward the aisle. Each step forward felt like lifting the weight of the cabin on his shoulders. A woman reached out as he passed, brushing his sleeve as though touching him might tether her hope to something stronger than fear. The aisle stretched before him like a runway, his shadow cast long by the amber lights, stretched into a silhouette that looked half ghost, half savior. Behind him, Riley whispered again, her voice trembling with both fear and faith. "Daddy." Connor hesitated, his hand brushing the edge of the cockpit door. It stood slightly ajar, glowing with the constellation of instruments beyond, the light of a world he'd sworn never to return to. His palm was slick with sweat. 3 years of exile warred with every instinct burned into his bones. He knocked softly. "First Officer Park," he said, voice low but firm. I have some pilot experience." The words felt foreign, like speaking a language he hadn't dared to use in years. And as he stepped closer, the broken watch on his wrist caught the glow of the instruments. Its hands were still frozen at the moment of his failure, but his heart beat on, daring to measure a new moment. The cockpit glowed like a shrine of instruments, every dial and screen flickering with restless life. Connor stepped inside, his boots crossing a threshold he had promised himself he would never touch again. The smell hit him first. Electronics warmed by stress, the faint bite of aviation fuel, and the sharper tang of sweat that clung to uniforms under pressure. It was the scent of battlefields fought not with bullets but with buttons and switches. First Officer Jessica Park looked up from the controls, her profile etched in amber light. She was younger than her voice had suggested, probably early 30s, her dark hair pulled back into a regulation bun that trembled slightly as she moved. Her uniform was immaculate despite the chaos, but sweat darkened the fabric under her arms. Her eyes carried an intensity that only came from staring at mortality and refusing to blink. "Thank God," she exhaled, the relief in her voice reaching deeper than professionalism, brushing against something personal. "Captain Mitchell collapsed 23 minutes ago. Heart attack, we think. He's unresponsive. Paramedics are waiting on the ground, but right now," she gestured at the blinking panel, "right now I need someone who knows what they're looking at." Connor's gaze swept over the instruments. Altimeter, airspeed indicator, attitude gyro, warnings blinking in angry red, hydraulic pressure falling in slow increments, autopilot light flickering as if unsure whether it was friend or foe. He hadn't sat in this seat in 3 years, but the language of these instruments returned like a forgotten song, every note carved into muscle memory. Jessica's voice cut through his reverie. "How much experience?" Connor hesitated. He could have said he was just a mechanic. He could have said he had dabbled, trained a little, but the truth rose unbidden, heavier than denial. "Military background, F-16s, Luke Air Force Base, 12 years active duty, flight instructor for 4. He paused, the next word sticking like glass in his throat. "I haven't flown since 2021. Jessica's hands stilled on the throttle. Her eyes flicked to his, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw recognition flare like lightning across her face. But then it was gone, tucked behind layers of training and composure. "You'll do," she said. "Take the left seat." The captain's chair shifted automatically, whirring into position as Connor lowered himself into it. The weight of it pressed against him like judgment. He adjusted the harness, hands trembling only slightly as they found familiar straps and buckles. Before him stretched the symphony of gauges, lights and warnings, the orchestra of survival waiting for its conductor. "Hydraulics are bleeding slowly," Jessica said, her voice clipped, autopilot intermittent. "Navigation's fine for now, but the storm system over Seattle is worse than forecast. We're flying into a wall of turbulence and wind shear." Connor nodded, his fingers moving without conscious thought, checking systems, cross-referencing dials. "Fuel? Just enough for a direct descent, not enough for diversions unless we dump passengers in Portland, and even that's questionable with weather." The reality settled over them. No turning back, no alternate routes, Seattle or nothing. Connor's jaw tightened. "All right, we're riding this down ourselves." For the first time, Jessica allowed her mask to slip. She looked at him, not as a fellow pilot, but as someone who had once shared a different sky. "Luke Air Force Base, you said?" Her voice carried something heavier than curiosity. Connor glanced at her. "Yeah, left in 2021. Jessica swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the storm data scrolling across the screen. "You wouldn't happen to remember a Lieutenant Jessica Park, would you? Call sign Viper." The cockpit seemed to shrink. The instrument lights blurred, the chronometer on his wrist pulsed with phantom weight, and suddenly, memories detonated like flares against the night sky. Viper, the wingman scheduled to fly with Marcus that day, the woman who had been grounded at the last second when Connor volunteered to take her slot, hungry for extra instructor hours, the woman who had tried to reach him after the accident, whose phone calls he had ignored, whose letters he had returned unopened, the one voice he had shut out because hearing her meant hearing forgiveness he didn't deserve. He turned slowly toward her, reading the recognition mirrored in her face. "Phoenix," she said softly, using his old call sign like a key to a locked room inside him. Her voice carried forgiveness and accusation in equal measure. "I tried to find you after Marcus's accident. The investigation cleared you. Everyone knew the ejection seat failed. Everyone but you." Connor's throat closed. The storm outside raged, lightning painting the sky like cracked glass, but the storm inside was worse. "I walked away," he whispered. "I couldn't carry it anymore." Jessica's hand tightened on the yoke, knuckles white. "And now you're back." The cockpit shook with turbulence, forcing them both to focus. Warning chimes echoed. Passengers screamed faintly from the cabin beyond. Connor's hands steadied on the controls, instincts overriding guilt. His eyes flicked to Jessica's, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe the air of responsibility again. "Let's get them home," he said. Jessica nodded, her composure snapping back like a steel cable. "All right, Phoenix, let's fly." The aircraft pitched, the storm swallowing them whole, and together they guided the wounded 737 toward the violent dark ahead. Seattle Center's voice crackled through the radios like distant thunder. "Horizon 247, say souls and fuel." Jessica answered first, steady and clipped. 180 souls, fuel minimal for direct Seattle. Captain incapacitated, medical on arrival. Copy, Horizon 247. Your priority. Expect vectors ILS-16 left. Be advised, reports of moderate to severe wind shear on final. Connor and Jessica exchanged a look. No illusions left. This would be flown by hand. Connor wrapped his fingers around the yoke, feeling the faint vibration of air clawing at metal. The aircraft rolled slightly, as if the storm itself were testing him. He countered with a touch. Small inputs, the kind he'd drilled into cadets until they were bored of being perfect. Muscle memory, patient, unhurried, rose like a tide. "Checklist," Jessica said. "Hydraulic B pressure, dropping but holding. Autopilot, leave it off. I want stick and rudder." She nodded, already moving through the panel. Warning tones chirped in disagreeable harmony, instruments painting a tangle of precipitation ahead. Connor trimmed, felt the nose relax, and listened to the pitch of the engines, like a musician in an orchestra pit. He pressed the intercom. "Folks, this is Connor in the cockpit with First Officer Park." The name felt strange on a cabin PA. "We've got some weather ahead. We're trained for this. Stay seated, belts tight. Flight attendants, secure the cabin." Far behind him, in row 12, he imagined Riley lifting her head, putting the voice together with the truth. He pictured her fingers finding the belt buckle and clicking it twice, the way he'd taught her when she was small enough to fit on his forearm. He let that image anchor him, a single bright bead on a string of dark moments. Turbulence hit like a drum roll. The 737 shuddered. Overhead bins trembled. A wave of gasps rolled forward from the cabin. Jessica's voice stayed calm. "Speed? Holding. Descent to flight level 230. Roger." He eased them down, each 1,000 feet a rung on a ladder slick with ice. The weather radar painted pulsing cores in shades that meant, "Do not go here." Lightning strobed the distance. Rain hammered the fuselage like handfuls of nails. Inside the cockpit, the world narrowed to numbers and breath. Jessica adjusted the ND. "Cell splitting at R12. We thread the gap or take a hard right." "We thread it." She glanced at him, assessing, then nodded. "Thread it is." The aircraft shouldered into the valley between storm towers. Air went from ragged to savage, to merely unruly. Connor felt the right wing lift, corrected with rudder, then aileron. The yoke fought back as if insulted by the presumption of control. He held his ground with the patient brutality of a craftsman who knows wood will bend if asked correctly. "Phoenix," Jessica said, and the call sign didn't hurt anymore. "Remember the Nellis crosswind drill." "Feet light, hands lighter," he murmured, eyes outside, heart inside. She smirked despite herself. "You used to add ego nowhere." "Still applies." A chime. "Seattle again, Horizon 247, reduce speed to 210, descend to 14,000, maintain present heading." 210, 14,000, present heading, Jessica read back. Her cadence was a metronome keeping panic in 4/4 time. The cockpit dimmed another shade as cloud swallowed them. Rain smeared the windscreen into a canvas of motion. The world outside vanished. The world inside became law. Connor centered the needles, breath slow, elbows loose. The old rhythm returned. Decide, verify, do, feel, confirm, act. He could almost hear Marcus's laugh in the headset, the way he'd say, "You fly like you're telling the air a secret, Hayes." His throat tightened, then loosened on the next exhale. "Gear later. Flaps on my call. Copy." The cabin phone chirped. Jessica answered, listening, nodding. She covered the mouthpiece. Riley asked a flight attendant if her dad is the pilot. Connor kept his eyes on the horizon line he could not see. What did they tell her? That he's doing what he does best. His hand steadied even more. Good answer. The altimeter unwound. The air thickened with unseen walls. An abrupt downdraft punched them. The VSI stabbed downward. Alarms spoke in their hard little voices. Connor nudged power, pitched for attitude, refused to chase the needle. The airplane sagged, considered despair, rediscovered lift, and kept flying. Nicely done, Jessica said. Taught this to 1,000 kids. Saved 180 tonight. He didn't respond. Saving, like guilt, felt better measured after landing. Another vector. Left heading 170. Maintain 10,000. Jessica read back. Connor turned them. The storm showed its teeth, and then, unexpected grace, the clouds thinned. Through a wet veil, the world hinted at itself. A smudge of shore lights, the dark geometry of a city bracing against winter. A thread of runway lights far to the south, like beads scattered on velvet. Seattle, Jessica whispered, as if naming it might keep it from slipping away. Wind updates, 240 at 28, gusts 42. She winced, quartering tail cross. We'll need the crab, then kick. Kick and pray, he said. But we'll land it. He set approach speed, mind dividing itself neatly. One part for numbers, one for muscle, one for the small girl in row 12, who would need a father on the ground more than a legend in the sky. He could feel Viper beside him, matching his tempo, trusting him not because of the past, but in spite of it. Flaps 1, he said. Flaps 1, flaps 5. Armed, localizer alive, Jessica called. Glide slope captured. Manual to the end, Connor said. Manual to the end, she echoed. No autopilot would take this landing. No machine would carry the blame or the absolution. The amber glow deepened, wrapping the cockpit in a quiet that existed only at the center of chaos. Connor slid the crab in, nose into the wind, fuselage skewed to track the center line that appeared, vanished, appeared again through the rain. The airplane spoke a language of hiss and howl. He answered in pressure and angle. 500, Jessica announced. Stable. Continue. Wind shear caution. The computer's voice cut in, flat and merciless. Correcting, Connor said. A touch of power, a breath of rudder, a whisper of bank. The needles obeyed with reluctant respect. 300. Continue. Minimums. Landing, he said. The most dangerous and honest word in flying. The runway swam toward them, a ribbon trembling in the gale. Connor felt the old power gather in his hands, not heroism but craft, the ordinary miracle of doing one thing exactly right when it most matters. Hold it, Jessica murmured. Hold. The cockpit vibrated like a living creature straining against its own bones. The runway loomed closer, wavering in curtains of snow and rain, a silver thread across a black ocean. Every second stretched thin, each breath a negotiation between control and chaos. 200, Jessica called, her voice steel over the storm. Connor held the crab, nose skewed into the wind, fuselage tracking sideways like a defiant animal refusing the leash. His feet danced on rudder pedals, hands poised on the yoke with the precision of a surgeon about to make the final cut. Correcting drift, he muttered. The plane resisted, tilting, bucking. He felt every gust, every invisible hand of the storm trying to pry them loose from the sky. His heartbeat matched the altimeter's descent. 100, amber lights blurred past the windows. He could sense passengers holding their breath in unison, as if stillness might steady the aircraft. Somewhere in row 12, Riley's small hands clutched the belt strap, her lips forming silent prayers to a father she had only just learned was more than a mechanic. 50. Jessica's voice was calm, almost reverent. Kick it, Phoenix. Connor eased the rudder, straightening the nose, aligning metal and will with the trembling center line. Crosswind clawed at them viciously, but his hands were steady, his training absolute. 30, 20, 10. The main gear kissed asphalt with a jolt that felt like salvation. Tires screeched, rubber burning against concrete. The unmistakable chirp of survival declared. The fuselage rattled, wings flexed, but they were down. Connor deployed thrust reversers, the engines roaring in reverse like lions forced into cages. Water sprayed across the windscreen. The plane howled, slowed, obeyed. He pressed the brakes, steady and smooth, the way thousands of landings had taught him. Except this one carried more than checklists. It carried absolution. 60 knots, Jessica reported, her voice breaking just slightly now that death had loosened its grip. Connor eased back on power, coaxing the aircraft down the runway like a wounded animal limping home. The storm outside still raged, but inside the wheels hummed against earth, the music of deliverance. They slowed to taxi speed. Connor exhaled, a sound closer to a sob than a breath. His hands lingered on the yoke, unwilling to let go, unwilling to release the truth that he had guided them safely through the storm. From the cabin came the sound, first a scattered clap, then a wave, applause, desperate and grateful. It rolled forward like thunder, mingling with sobs, laughter, prayers shouted in a dozen tongues. Strangers clutching each other as though survival had bound them into family. Connor's shoulders sagged. He allowed himself a glance at Jessica. Her hands were trembling as she flipped switches, shutting systems down with mechanical precision betrayed by adrenaline's aftershock. "You did it," she whispered, and the words carried more weight than the landing itself. She used his call sign like a benediction. "You did it, Phoenix." The name cracked something inside him. For 3 years he had buried it, convinced it belonged to a ghost. Now it rang again, not as a curse but as absolution. He blinked against the sting in his eyes. "Cabin secure," Jessica said formally, but her voice trembled, betraying relief. Connor leaned forward, looking through the rain-smeared windscreen. Emergency vehicles were already racing along the runway, red and white lights strobing across the wet tarmac. They would take the captain, check the passengers, make sense of the chaos, but none of them could understand what had shifted inside him. Behind him, the applause swelled. He heard Riley's voice above it all, small but fierce. "That's my dad." The words pierced him deeper than any medal, any commendation ever had. More powerful than promotions, more permanent than wings pinned on a uniform. That was his reward. The trust of a little girl who believed in miracles because she had watched her father make one. Jessica reached out, her hand brushing his on the throttle. Not command, not instruction, just human contact. "You were never broken," she said softly. "You only thought you were." Connor swallowed, unable to answer. The chronometer on his wrist caught the dim cockpit light. For the first time in 3 years, he thought he saw its second-hand twitch. Not much, just enough. "Taxi us in," Jessica asked gently, deferring where she didn't have to. Connor nodded. His voice was rough but steady. "Let's bring them all the way home." The aircraft rolled off the runway, water spraying from its wheels. The applause followed, echoing into silence as passengers collapsed into tears and embraces. Flight attendants whispered thanks they didn't need to rehearse. And at the heart of it all sat a single father who had wrestled his past, and for one impossible hour, reclaimed the sky. The plane settled into silence, the engines winding down to a weary hum. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to retreat, muffled by the walls of metal that had carried them through. Then the spell broke. The door at the front burst open, and paramedics clattered aboard with their equipment, voices crisp and urgent as they hurried toward the cockpit. Jessica unbuckled and moved aside, guiding them to the captain slumped motionless in his chair. They worked with clinical speed, attaching monitors, speaking in clipped phrases that cut through the fading echoes of passenger applause. Connor sat back in the left seat, watching them work, his hands still resting on the yoke, even though the aircraft no longer demanded him. He exhaled slowly. For the first time since the call for a pilot had shattered the cabin, he was aware of the dampness on his palms, the ache in his shoulders, the sting of sweat cooling against his temples. 3 years of exile had ended in less than an hour, and the cost was measured in a body carried out on a stretcher and a chronometer that seemed to pulse against his wrist. From the cabin came the sound of footsteps running down the aisle. He turned just in time to see Riley, a small figure darting past a flight attendant, who tried half-heartedly to stop her. She launched herself into the cockpit, straight into his arms, clutching him with the desperate strength of a child who had spent too many minutes imagining she might lose everything. "Daddy," she cried, burying her face into his neck. "I knew you could fix it." Connor closed his eyes. Her words carried more weight than the applause, heavier than Jessica's whispered absolution. He kissed the top of her head, inhaling the scent of crayons and fear and love. His hands trembled around her, not from the landing but from the realization that the trust he thought he'd lost had been there all along, in the only set of eyes that truly mattered. "You were so brave," he whispered. "Braver than me." Riley shook her head fiercely. "You're my dad. You can do anything." The cabin door clattered again. Flight attendants ushered passengers back into their seats, calming voices threading order into chaos. Outside, the storm still clawed at the airport, but here, inside this cockpit, Connor felt something entirely different. Calm, fragile and new. Jessica's voice drew him back. "Connor." He looked up. She was standing by the first officer's seat, watching him with an expression that carried both history and future. For a moment the noise of paramedics, passengers and storm fell away. It was just the two of them, bound by years of silence and the fresh gravity of survival. "Phoenix," she said quietly, almost reverently, "do you understand now? It was never your fault." His jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to cling to guilt like a familiar anchor, but her eyes didn't waver, and Riley's arms didn't loosen, and for the first time he felt the argument slip through his fingers. "I should have been better," he muttered. "You were exactly who you needed to be," Jessica replied. "Marcus knew it. I knew it. Everyone did. The only one who didn't was you." Her words landed softly, like snow settling on broken ground, filling the cracks instead of deepening them. He had ignored her letters, rejected her calls, built walls so thick even the truth couldn't penetrate. And yet, here she was, standing in the same cockpit, offering not just survival, but forgiveness. The paramedics lifted Captain Mitchell onto a stretcher, his face pale but alive, monitors beeping with faint reassurance. They moved quickly out the door, followed by a flight attendant giving updates to anxious passengers. Connor stood slowly, Riley still clinging to him, her small body pressed against the mechanic's shirt that now carried the weight of a pilot's return. As he stepped into the aisle, passengers turned their heads, faces streaked with tears, cheeks flushed with adrenaline, eyes full of gratitude. A woman in first class reached for his sleeve as he passed, whispering, "Thank you." A man bowed his head, murmuring prayers in Spanish. Children waved with trembling smiles. Connor wanted to vanish under their gaze. He had never flown for applause, but tonight their eyes didn't feel like judgment. They felt like trust placed in hands that had proven worthy once more. At row 12, he lowered Riley gently back into her seat. She refused to let go completely, her hand gripping his even as she sat down. He smiled faintly, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "You're safe now," he said softly. "We're safe." Behind him, Jessica lingered. She leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, her eyes following him like they had in formation flights years ago, reading intentions without words. "You're not finished, Connor," she said quietly enough that only he could hear. "The sky isn't done with you." He didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted to Riley, to her coloring book lying open on the floor. Pages of blue crayon skies and silver planes, innocent and fearless. Maybe the sky wasn't finished with him. Or maybe, just maybe, it was offering him a second chance. The chronometer on his wrist ticked once, faint but undeniable, as though agreeing. The aircraft sat motionless at the gate, its body still quivering from the violence it had endured. Outside, rain streaked down the windows like the sky itself was weeping, cleansing away the storm. Inside, passengers slowly gathered their belongings, movements shaky, hesitant as if rising from seats too quickly might tempt fate to change its mind. Connor remained near row 12, Riley tucked beneath his arm, her head resting against his chest. Her heartbeat was fast but steady, a tiny metronome sinking him back to life. Around them people whispered, hugged, even laughed, relief reshaping strangers into something closer to family. Jessica emerged from the cockpit, her hair slightly disheveled, her uniform damp with sweat. She walked the aisle like a soldier after battle, exhausted, upright and carrying more than anyone could see. Passengers reached for her as well, murmuring gratitude, but her eyes sought only Connor. When she reached him, she crouched down so Riley could see her. "Your dad is extraordinary," she said softly, her voice thick but steady. Riley nodded solemnly, as though confirming something she had always known. "I told him he could fix it." Jessica smiled faintly and looked up at Connor. For a long moment no words passed between them, only the weight of years, the ghosts of a desert sky, and the undeniable truth that forgiveness had been sitting between them all along. Outside, paramedics wheeled Captain Mitchell across the wet tarmac, lights flashing red against the curtain of rain. Connor glanced after them, then back at Jessica. "He's alive?" She nodded. "They'll take care of him. He'll get another chance." Her eyes held his. "Just like you." He swallowed, throat raw. "I don't know if I deserve one." Jessica tilted her head, her voice gentle but unyielding. "You don't get to decide that, Phoenix. Life does. Tonight you proved it." The word Phoenix burned less now. It didn't feel like a wound, it felt like a promise. The crowd began to file out, each passenger offering nods and murmured blessings as they passed. One by one, they left behind the aluminum sanctuary that had carried them through fear. At last the cabin emptied until only the three of them remained, Connor, Riley and Jessica. Riley lifted her head, her voice small but certain. "Daddy, will you fly again?" The question struck harder than the storm. Connor froze, his breath caught between memory and possibility. He looked down at her, the little girl who had believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself, and then at Jessica, who still stood steady waiting for his answer. He faltered, then tried again. "If I do, it won't be for me, it'll be for you." Riley's smile was shy, but it carried all the sunlight he thought he'd lost. "Then I want to come too." Jessica chuckled softly, a sound that cracked through the heavy air. "Careful," she teased. "She'll be asking you to teach her to fly next." Connor met Jessica's eyes. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. Silence settled, but it wasn't the silence of guilt or exile. It was the silence of dawn, of something beginning. They gathered Riley's coloring book from the floor. Its open page showed a bright crayon drawing of a Boeing 737 soaring through a blue sky, wings stretched like a promise. Connor held it for a moment, staring at the innocence of it, the unshakable belief that planes always flew, that skies were always friendly. He tucked it under his arm beside his daughter. As they walked off the plane, the air outside hit him with the sharp scent of jet fuel and wet pavement. Emergency lights flashed, ground crews moved like ants in the rain, and yet the world felt still. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, Riley's hand warm in his, Jessica lingering close enough that he could feel her presence without turning. Above them, the 737 loomed against the storm, not as a threat, not as a tomb, but as a survivor, like him. Riley tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Were you scared?" He crouched down, meeting her gaze honestly. "Yes, terrified. But you did it anyway," she said simply, as if that were all that mattered. Her truth cut through everything, the guilt, the years, the broken watch still strapped to his wrist. He looked at it once more. For the briefest second he swore the frozen hands twitched, ticking forward as if to remind him that time was moving again. Jessica's voice came quietly beside him. "The sky isn't done with you, Connor." He straightened, holding Riley close, looking out across the rain-slick runway, where lights shimmered like scattered stars. For the first time in years, he didn't feel banished from the sky. He felt invited, Maybe not, he said softly. Riley giggled, her laughter cutting through the storm, bright and defiant. It mingled with the hum of the airport, the roll of thunder, the whisper of jet engines preparing for their own departures. And as Connor Hayes carried his daughter into the uncertain night, with Jessica walking silently at his side, he realized that redemption hadn't come from flying the plane. Redemption had come from daring to try again, having opened doors that had been closed by the subtle discrimination that kept women pilots grounded in corporate boardrooms instead of captains' chairs, where their skills could be measured by results instead of assumptions. Their friendship had been rebuilt on the foundation of shared survival and mutual respect for the weight that aircraft carried beyond just passengers and cargo. The dreams and fears and hopes of people who trusted strangers with their lives every time they buckled themselves into seats and surrendered control to pilots they'd never met but had to trust completely. "Daddy, will you teach me to fly someday?"
Riley asked, her voice cutting through the engine noise and bringing Connor Uncock's attention back to the moment that mattered most, the present, where his daughter was growing up, with the assumption that her father was someone who could do impossible things, like bring aircraft safely through storms that would terrify ordinary mortals. He reached up to steady her on his shoulders, feeling the solid weight of his daughter against the backdrop of aircraft ascending into the morning sky with the confidence of machines that had been built by people who understood that flying was both the most dangerous and most wonderful thing humans had ever learned to do.
The question hung in the air between them like the moment before a decision that would determine the direction of their lives for years to come. And Connor found himself calculating not wind speeds and approach angles, but the kind of future he wanted to build for the little girl who still believed her father could work miracles. Connor watched a Boeing 737 rotate into the sunrise, its wings catching the golden light like a promise written across the desert sky. The same type of aircraft that had carried them through the storm 8 months ago and given him back his wings along with his faith in the possibility that some stories didn't end with accidents but began with them. The same type he'd maintained for 3 years without allowing himself to remember what it felt like to command from the left seat, where decisions mattered and skills were measured in lives saved instead of engines overhauled. "When you're ready and when I'm ready," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of lessons learned about trust and forgiveness and the price of keeping yourself grounded when you were meant to fly, when the sky was calling your name in the language of wind and altitude and the endless possibility that lay beyond the horizon. "But first," he continued, watching the aircraft climb toward clouds that looked like cotton balls instead of storm cells, "let's make sure we both know how to land safely." Riley giggled, her laughter mixing with the sound of departing aircraft and the desert wind that had once carried Connor's dreams beyond the horizon and was now bringing them back home on wings built from second chances and the understanding that some stories didn't end with crashes, but continued with the kind of redemption that could only be earned through the willingness to try again, despite the certainty that trying again meant risking failure again. The chronometer on his wrist ticked steadily forward, marking time that was no longer frozen in the past, but flowing toward a future where the sky was no longer his enemy, but his oldest friend, waiting patiently for his return, with the kind of infinite patience that only the heavens could provide. Around them, Phoenix Sky Harbor hummed with the activity of aircraft taking off and landing, pilots and passengers and ground crews, all playing their parts in the daily miracle of commercial aviation, where strangers trusted other strangers with their lives and were rarely disappointed by the transaction. Connor shifted Riley's weight on his shoulders and pointed toward a distant aircraft that was climbing toward the mountains, its contrails drawing lines across the desert sky like promises written in vapor and sunlight. Night, where being a father mattered more than being a pilot, and where the truest skills were measured not in bank angles or crosswind landings, but in bedtime stories, scraped knees, and promises kept. 8 months later, Connor stood beyond the chain-link fence at Phoenix Sky Harbor, the desert sun climbing above the horizon, spilling gold and crimson across the mountains. Aircraft thundered into the morning sky, their engines painting the silence with possibility. On his shoulders, Riley perched like a co-pilot, her laughter ringing out as she pointed at each departing jet. "That one's going to Denver, Daddy," she declared with the confidence of someone who had memorized timetables and routes as if they were fairy tales. Connor smiled, the expression no longer foreign to his face, no longer an effort pulled against gravity. Since that storm over Seattle, smiles had come easier, small miracles stitched into ordinary days. That night had not only carried him through turbulence, but returned to him something he thought was lost forever, the sky, and the belief that he still belonged to it. The morning air smelled of jet fuel and wild desert blooms, sharp with the promise of renewal. On his workbench at home, a laptop waited with an application half complete, regional airline, part-time pilot work. A chance to fly again without abandoning the maintenance work that had kept him grounded, provided, and tethered during the lost years. The chronometer on his wrist ticked faithfully now, its repaired hands moving forward, marking moments instead of freezing them in grief. Jessica's calls had become a rhythm in his life, as steady as takeoffs and landings, their voices crossing states, trading updates like flight plans, weaving threads of connection that stretched from cockpit to cockpit. She flew for a major carrier now, her path widened by the night she and Connor had wrestled a crippled aircraft through storm and fear. And with each call, with each remembered silence filled, Connor found himself believing a little more in second chances. Riley leaned forward on his shoulders, whispering into his ear with all the innocence of a child who believed her father could do anything. "Daddy, will you teach me to fly someday?" He looked up at the departing jet, its wings catching fire in the sunrise, and felt the weight of her words. "Not burden, promise. When you're ready," he murmured, steady and sure, "and when I'm ready." And as the aircraft climbed into the open sky, Connor Hayes felt the horizon call to him again, not as exile, but as invitation. If you believe that no matter how broken we feel, life always gives us a second chance, then this story is for you. Remember, redemption doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from having the courage to try again. If Connor's journey touched your heart, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who might need a reminder of hope, and subscribe for more stories that prove even in the darkest storms, there's always light waiting on the horizon.